All right. I think we probably will still have some people joining us, but I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk with Dr. Banafsheh Ranji about her book. And I hope that y'all enjoy the spotlighting an author session. So right now, Iran stands at a critical juncture, and it's essential for us to examine its history and its transformations in order to better understand the trajectories of its future. Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us today and for playing a part of that vital conversation. Today, we will be discussing Dr. Banafsheh Ranji's Journalistic Practices in Restrictive Contexts, a sociological approach to the case of Iran. Dr. Ranji, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at the Iran 1400 Project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The Iran 1400 Project's mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century in order to promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. Your book's insightful observations and analysis of journalistic practices will certainly contribute to that mission. It is a great privilege to have you here today and to benefit from your expertise. For those in the audience, Dr. Banafsheh Ranji is a postdoctoral research fellow in sociology. She studies the socialization of refugees in Norway, and in addition to her interest in the field of everyday life experiences of minority communities, she has extensively worked on the sociology of media and sociology of journalism, with a particular focus on politically restrictive contexts. She is also working on the project Media Representations of Immigrants and Their Impact on Integration, where she studies the coverage of immigrants by Norwegian media during the COVID pandemic and how the coverage has influenced immigrants' everyday life experiences. For those who have not yet made it to a spotlighting an author session, I can explain the format, which is we'll have about 30 minutes to listen to Dr. Ranji present her book, and she's prepared a PowerPoint presentation for that. And then after that, we'll have about a 5-minute break where I will go through some of the Iran 1400 Project's events and announcements that we have. And then after that, we will open it up to the floor for a Q&A session. And you can submit those questions at any time during the event, during the presentation, up until during the Q&A, so that you don't forget those questions. And you can also post your questions to the YouTube chat, and we'll check that as well. So without further ado, Dr. Ranji, whenever you are ready, we can begin the presentation, and I will share my screen so that we can see your PowerPoint. Pull that up. All right.
Thank you for the great introduction, and thanks for the invitation, for the nice invitation. It's an honor to present my book to the public audience. So I'll start with so as you see, this is the outcome of 3 years of research during my PhD studies at the University of Oslo from 2016 to 2019, and it turned into a book later in 2022. If we move to the next slide. So the book includes 7 chapters. Introductory chapter, Journalism in Restrictive Contexts. Chapter 2 is a historical outline of the Iranian media field after the 1979 revolution. Chapter 3 conceptualizes journalistic practices in restrictive contexts based on a combination of Bourdieu's theory of practice and a new sociology perspective. Chapter 4 is addressing professional identity of the Iranian journalists that participated in my study. Chapter 5, Iranian journalism as a field of divergent forces, discusses a wide range of forces that influence the journalistic field in the Iranian context. Chapter 6, journalistic double game strategies, includes the strategies that are being used by Iranian journalists that I interviewed in order to bypass the restrictions on an everyday basis and at the same time avoid political risks. And chapter 7 is focusing on why macro and meso processes matter in understanding journalism in a restrictive context. I was inspired to do this research during the time that I was working as a journalist in Tehran in 2013. At the time, apart from political pressures, many of us journalists who were working for privately owned media were facing poor employment conditions and low wages. I had, for instance, no insurance coverage, no set contract, and in 1 year, I changed my workplace 4 times due to job insecurity and precarious working conditions. Many of my colleagues were working on a regular salary basis for more than one employer or had jobs outside of journalism. Meanwhile, a lack of an independent organization supporting journalists and holding employers accountable left us without any institutional power to protect ourselves. As we all know, the authorities shut down the Association of Iranian Journalists in 2009 and have not permitted reopening. If one asked then at the time that why are you doing journalism, my answer was often for the sake of social influence. The obvious political repressions in Iran may give the impression that Iranian journalism, similarly to journalism in other politically restrictive contexts, is an absolute subordinated realm to political impositions. I initially started to ask myself at the beginning of this research that how is it that critical journalism or journalism in general has continued to exist in Iran and in other similar countries, and why some journalists in restrictive contexts are willing to risk their political and economic safety. The next slide actually shows so this is the comment. It must be dangerous to be a journalist in Iran. Is there a lot of self-censorship? This is a comment I received quite a few times during the time I was doing my PhD, which reveals the bias that sees Iranian journalists mainly involved in self-censorship due to state's use of coercion. I observed that the narrative that is more pleasing is the narrative of journalists as victims of state repression. I also observed that the way the topic of journalism in Iran is approached is not an exception to the pattern of how social realities in contexts that are called non-Western are portrayed. These portrayals are often characterized by generalization and simplifying the other, or as Farsaid put it, by Orientalism. In most of the existing narratives, everything that is considered non-West is confined in its own social domain from the vantage point of the established truths. And in the case of journalism in Iran, this spatial domain is the following: a journalistic culture that is determined by political forces and consequently does not represent professional, good, critical journalism as it exists in the West. Recent developments in journalism research, such as the de-Westernization project, has not helped with moving beyond established stereotypes. While they have claimed that they aim to challenge Orientalism rooted in the knowledge of non-West, they have remained within the Orientalist paradigm due to their focus on cultural distinction between what is referred to as West and non-West, and considering culture as an explanatory factor. So I actually, as evidenced in the interviews that I conducted with journalists and as the findings of my study shows, the picture is actually more complex than what is often portrayed in the literature or even in the human rights organizations reports and in the mainstream media. If we look at the next slide, which is about a professional identity of the journalists that I interview with, the data shows that the journalists that I interviewed identify as advocative radical journalists or critical monitorial journalists. So these are the main two roles that the Iranian journalists that I interviewed with consider for themselves as sort of social roles, social journalistic roles in the Iranian context. Journalistic perception of their roles tell us how they collectively shape the field's borders and laws, or as Bourdieu puts it, shape the field's norms. Role perceptions also reveal how journalists commonly define what journalism is for and delimit legitimate actors and legitimate practices in the field. And these journalists that I interviewed often fall into the categories that are actually addressed by journalism literature, such as adversary, advocate, change agent, educator, detective, watchdog, and informer roles. So they mainly strive for bringing a change, and they show an adversarial relationship with the central power and with the state. And they show a high tendency to stand by the side of people, which actually reveals the advocative radical role, which is mostly about a change agent or journalists who are willing to bring macro level social changes. The other role that they identify with is critical monitorial role, which is more about watchdog role of journalism that is more universal among journalists all around the world. And in this category, journalists mostly talk about the role of press as fourth estate and how it should actually act as watchdogs of those in power. Based on how Iranian journalists identify their social roles, the evidence in the data shows that they put value on preserving journalistic identity, operating over time, and allowing the press to operate regardless of the pressures that they face in the Iranian context. And these factors, operation over time and survival of the press, are actually criteria for a definition of journalistic success in the Iranian context. So in the Iranian context, or in a similarly restrictive context, journalistic success could be understood as a collective success, which is quite in contradictory of how it is understood in a context like, for instance, I can say in the Norwegian context, journalistic success is very much understood as an individual achievement of journalists, such as gaining a press prize or having prestigious profile, and sort of being the first person in competition with other journalists. And this journalistic success in the Iranian context, as I say, it means that the journalists have the understanding that they are not able to function unless the whole press in the Iranian context function. So there is no individual success unless there is collective success. If we move to the next slide, we can see that my study shows that Iranian journalism field, although being mainly explained similarly to other restrictive contexts through structural explanations and through reference to the level of state coercion, is actually influenced by multiple actors or multiple forces or multiple mechanisms of influence of the political field, such as the state control of media that could include use of coercion, crackdown on media, as well as written and unwritten rules, or how journalists call it, written and unwritten red lines. And the other important factor is the state of uncertainty that Iranian journalists talk about a lot. They use different metaphors to talk about, to express this state of uncertainty, such as walking in a minefield, walking a tightrope, walking on the edge of a cliff, and wrestling. So these are all, or playing poker. These are all the metaphors that are used by the journalists to express this state of the experiences of a state of uncertainty. And a state of uncertainty in the Iranian context mostly includes the security outlook of the political field. When I talk about the political field in an Iranian context, we should consider that political field and economic field are closely intertwined in the Iranian context. So those who have power over politics have also power over economy. Yes, so security outlook, which may sound quite familiar to those who are familiar with the context, is that any official or any institution, any state institution may consider a topic actually as a potential threat against the national security of the country. And the leader's position on issues, this actually is more about how the leader sees different topics and approaches different topics and different individuals. And accordingly, this can influence the level of freedom or limitation that journalists experience regarding that particular topic. Another factor which is very important is the factional actors, including both reformists and conservatives who restrict press freedom in favor of their own factions. There has been a lot of idealization of reformist faction in the Iranian context, that they are actually pro-free press, or that press have more open space of maneuver during the presidents that are more reformist. But actually, my study shows that journalists are to a large extent also restricted by reformists. Official news sources is more about how different institutions, organizations, could it be a state institution or other forms of organizations, restrict journalists' access to information. The next slide is actually could be very interesting because what we know about the context, such as Iran, is that journalistic field is very much influenced and shaped by political impositions from outside the journalistic field. However, my study shows that there is a range of meso-level forces or organizational forces that actually restrict journalistic practices in the Iranian context. And one of the most important of these forces is instrumentalization of press by various actors, and the position of news and a particular news media regarding its affiliation and policy. And there is this general assumption that if media are privately owned, they could be more free. It's not only related to the Iranian context, also in other contexts. It is often understood that if media is privately owned, there is perhaps more space for journalistic maneuver. But the study actually shows that it's not about the type of ownership, it's more about the policy, especially the news organization's propensity to play a politically risky game, which means that the journalistic space of maneuver is very much influenced by the level of news organizations' willingness to play with the boundaries of restrictions and to push the boundaries of restrictions, and their willingness to play a politically risky game. Another factor that largely influences a journalistic outcome, or what journalists end up with at the end of the day as they report or as the content that is supposed to be published, is the hierarchical editing process, which shows that different staff at news organizations that have different level of power have varying degrees of influence on the journalistic production. And because in so many cases, this state of uncertainty that is imposed from the outside of the journalistic field is also practiced by the staff that are in the higher positions. So they may actually make arbitrary decisions about a particular topic, or that a topic may not actually be a red line, but just the editor or the manager thinks that, no, it cannot be published. It's just the personal judgment of the person that influences journalistic practices. About poor employment conditions, that is a very important factor. It includes a wide range of factors, including job insecurity, low salary, no insurance, no set contracts, no employment benefits, but also access to the tools that are necessary for journalistic work, such as access to audio recording tools or video recording tools. There is actually, if we move to the next slide, we can see that how critical journalists, how critical journalists sometimes actually struggle with organizational forces over what journalism should be. And they struggle to the same extent as they struggle with political pressures. One of the journalists, for instance, said, I have tried always to tell the editor-in-chief and the executive editor that there is pressure on everyone. You should not retreat after a call from the authorities. I have told them, if you want to retreat, why have you decided to run a newspaper? What does journalism mean for you? So we can see that the definition of journalism, or how journalists define the boundaries of journalistic field or journalistic and the laws or the norms of the journalistic field, is actually a subject of a struggle with organizational forces as well as political pressures, political forces. Critical journalists have often tended to work for reformist media chambers, so as to have more space to maneuver and be able to publish more critical stories. These media organizations, however, have exploited journalists' motivations to do critical journalism for very low wages. When protesting for poor working conditions, the study shows that the journalists experience dismissal or the threat of being fired by news organizations' top executives. For instance, the following quotation, if you enter, yes. One of the journalists said, after posting my critiques of the news organization on Facebook, which was a reformist news organization, an objection was shaped in the newsroom to the employment conditions. We were on a strike and the manager considered me to be the cause of the objection and fired me. Next slide. More enters. Yes, more. One more? Yeah. So considering all these challenges, the following questions arise. Does journalism or critical journalism exist in Iran? Our journalists in Iran are unable, as it is often assumed, to think and practice professionally due to this range of restrictions. If we focus on the level of political freedom, which is often the case, and if we also look at like human rights organizations rankings such as Freedom House, which considers mostly the level of political freedom afforded to journalists, the answer would be no. If we look into macro-level dimensions of journalistic practices and look at journalistic field as a domain of a flowing realm of senses, aspirations, emotions, actions, processes, and struggles, the answer would be yes. The journalists in this study define journalism as a game or an activity that requires strategic moves through the use of the following metaphors. Walking in a minefield, as I said, walking on the edge of a cliff, walking a tightrope, and playing poker. And all these walkings and maneuvers require playing a double game, which is the next slide. And in this playing, journalists actually make use of their journalistic habitus and their journalistic capitals, including social capitals, cultural capital, and symbolic capital. And this, in practice, means that journalists use different set of strategies during the different stages of news work to go around the red lines and at the same time avoid the risk that may be imposed on them by both news organizations and external forces. They, for instance, mobilize the network of connections that they have, including other journalists, activists, and their sort of hidden news forces in different organizations, lawyers, ordinary people, they sort of secret news sources at different locations. They also use the strategy of publicizing issues, or as they call it, shaping news waves, meaning that they try to mobilize different actors around the topic and convince them and bring them into their own game. They also use the strategy of putting words into officials' mouths, which is more about collecting the data or doing interviews with official news sources in a way that they get the intended answers. This may sound a bit strange if we want to think about journalistic objectivity. So the next set of practices include using the official discourse as a shield, meaning that they often shield themselves by using what is acceptable within the established discourse. Using euphemisms, meaning that they replace sensitive words with other words that are less sensitive, or they have learned during the journalistic experiences that they have which words are more sensitive and which words are less sensitive, which words are allowed, which words are totally forbidden, and claiming objectivity. Claiming objectivity could be about reporting on a topic while the topic in itself is sensitive, while they actually don't involve their personal opinions, but because the topic is or the report is only about reporting, they can claim that they are just being objectives as journalists and they are just fulfilling their roles as informing the people. Struggling with conflict in the newsroom starts when journalists deliver their productions to the higher staff, their staff at the higher positions. And it may include negotiation, compliance, and defiance, depending on the depending on the on what journalists risk actually. So they may actually comply with journalistic orders, or they may defy organizational orders if they think that their journalistic symbolic capital is at risk, or if they sometimes think that a topic is of significance in itself from their point of view, they comply with some with some organizational orders or commands in order to be able to only publish on that topic. Also, the news outlet position level of influence shapes the journalist's decision about whether they want to comply or defy with organizational forces. If we move to the next slide, yes, yeah. So these are one more. There are more. Yeah. So if we, for instance, look at these publications that are actually after the recent revolutionary movement, these are the so-called reformist news outlets that have tried to stay still critical, regardless of the extreme pressures that exist in the current context of Iran. And these quotations by the participants in my study could be quite interesting in the sense that how journalists see themselves in the Iranian context and in relation to what are their social roles and how they see themselves in connection to the power or to the state. Journalism in Iran is a kind of battle. I enjoy the battle because almost no institution wants real journalism to happen in Iran. Another journalist said, when you see other journalists who participate in this battle and pay the price, you gain the motivation to work. May I ask how much do I have left?
For time, you probably have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so if we move to the next slide. Yeah, so this case of Sattar Beheshti was actually an example from a journalist who mobilized his network of connection to be able to cover the killing of Sattar Beheshti. He actually used his personal networks within the parliament, which are parliamentary members, to convince them that to raise the issue in the parliament public meeting. And he actually said that he and his colleagues were quite successful, and the parliamentary members rose this issue in the parliament public meeting, and then they could cover the issue because they could actually hide themselves behind parliamentary members. So he says, when a parliamentary member raised this issue, it was broadcast to the public, and it then became possible for us to further follow the issue. We still see the signs of critical journalism existing in the Iranian context. If we move to the next slide, there is a lot of content. If we just enter, yes, more, yes. So this is the case of Sattar Beheshti and Nika Shakarami, a 16-year-old girl who disappeared in Tehran during the protest, and a video containing forced confession of Nika's aunt and uncle and CCTV images allegedly attributed to Nika was published by the National Broadcasting IRIB. claiming that she was influenced by depression and she took her own life. A few days later, a report was published by Etemad newspaper where Nika's mom was interviewed and said that Nika was killed in the protest and they buried her without their consent. And that she said the person who was in the CCTV camera footage was not actually Nika. The report was later removed from the newspaper's website following orders from the security officials, actually, but at least it was already out and it was viral. Yes, if you move, we are all familiar with these two journalists who are very good examples of untold stories of journalists who have been involved in critical journalism. Ella Mohammadi and Niloufar Hamedi, who have been in prison since September 2022. And these are the screenshots from their reports on the killing of Jina Amini. If we move to the next slide, we know that Niloufar Hamedi has been for a long time involved in critical journalism. Her first report about a morality police was actually on about a shooting at a couple in Tehran's Partisan Park in 2021, for which police filed a complaint against her. And these are actually stories that we barely hear about, or actually none of, or could be that many of us haven't actually read their reports. We don't know how they write. We don't know about their writing style. We don't know about how these critical journalists write and how they practice journalism on an everyday basis. If we move to the next slide, another case that depicts the story of a critical journalist is Ella Mohammadi. In 2020, she wrote a report about Qarshak prison, the same prison where she was detained when she was actually arrested. And for that report, she went into trial and she was banned from being doing journalism for a year. But did she ever resort to self-censorship? No. In September 2022, she went to the funeral of Jina Amini and wrote a report with the headline, Homeland of Sorrow. And where she writes, "It was not yet 10 o'clock, the time for burying Jina, when they ordered to bury her and leave. But her family did not allow this. They took the door of the ambulance and waited for people, a Kurdish union. When it was 10 o'clock, more than 1,000 people had come for the funeral. The people of Saqqez, those who sing on occasions of joy and mourning. This time, they clapped their hands in mourning and sang the Kurdish song, 'Don't Leave Me Alone,' and they shouted, 'Jin Jian Azad.'" Next slide, then. Does critical and professional journalism exist in Iran? For answering this question, we need to talk about macro and meso processes that influence journalistic practices in that particular context. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I can stop the share. All right. Thank you so much for that. That was a really fascinating presentation, especially seeing its relevance as well. Of course, it's entirely relevant, but especially its relevance considering the Women Life Freedom protests. I was really glad that you included that as well. So for those in the audience, y'all feel free to submit your questions to Dr. Ranji in the Q&A, and I can get to them. But before we start on that, I do have a few announcements while those come in. So our most recent published article on our website, Iran1400.org, is Dance in Iran, and the Iranian Diaspora by Dr. Anthony Shea. It just came out about a month ago, so y'all can check it out there. Additionally, we stay tuned and subscribe to the Iran 1400 podcast, we have a podcast coming from Dr. Claudia Yacoubi about the evolution of sexuality in Iran that I'm really excited about. Also, we just released a compilation video on our YouTube channel of the essentially the women's movement and the past 150 years and how this context is necessary and relevant for the current woman life freedom movement. It features a variety of interviews from scholars such as Haide Moqisi, Frida Afari, Cameron Michael Amin, and much more. And you can find that on our YouTube channel, which is the Iran 1400 Project. And stay tuned and subscribe because we also have more interviews, individual interviews that we're going to be publishing about the woman life freedom movement, as well as other videos showing the evolution of ideas and institutions in Iran. On that note, continue to send those questions into the Q&A. But I'll start with one of my own questions, which is, as I said, there's a big focus on institutions at the Iran 1400 Project and their evolution over the past century or so. So considering journalistic practices, what are the institutions that play the largest role in journalism in Iran, whether that's governmental institutions or institutions that are led by the people that protect journalists and things like that?
What do you mean by involvement?
So which institutions, I know you don't always want to focus straight on censorship, so that's why I tried to say this question in another way. But to be more direct, what are the institutions in Iran that would play the largest role in censoring the press, and what the process of publishing an article, what institutions run by the government might play the biggest role in checking those, or having to run it by them, or maybe something's already been published and an institution might act to take it down. What we can say, those who don't know journalism in intense detail in Iran could assume that, the government of Iran has done this, but specifically what institution of the government has gone in and tried to influence journalism?
Well, there are different institutions that influence at different actually levels. We have, of course, the Press Supervisory Board, but we need to consider that in Iran, there is no organization, there is no official organization assigned for pre-publication censorship. So pre-publication censorship is conducted actually mostly by orders that news organization receives through random telephone calls to managers of news organizations, or it's being practiced through the news organization's editorial process, or it's practiced by journalists' self-censorship. But if you actually are curious to know whether there is an external organization that is particularly responsible for pre-publication control, there is no such a thing in the Iranian context. But news organizations always receive orders from the judiciary, for instance, from Press Supervisory Board through telephone calls that are unofficial. And they are being set to how to cover a specific issue and what to cover and what not to cover. So these are the main processes. Also, in some news organizations, there is only one staff called supervisor, or as we call it in Persian, Nazir, who is sitting there and who is actually reading journalist reports and stories, like carefully and in detail, and with different colors of pen and pencils, and each color may have a connotation, like a red or a blue or a green may have different connotations. And they actually, these supervisors are specifically responsible for censoring the content that are beyond the red lines. So this is actually about how it is being done before the publication. But after the publication, if you could say which institution is more actually playing the role of the for control and censorship, there is no clear answer. I mean, any random organization or any random institution, of course, the closer to the center of power, for instance, the institutions that are closer to the leader, have more power. And we know some of these organizations that are close to the leader or institutions. For instance, Imam Reza Shara'i. They have a lot of political power as well as economic power. So they are the center of actually economic capital as well. We can say, as a general rule, the closer the institution to the leader, because leader is responsible for directly leading and directly being responsible for certain institutions, and those institutions are quite sensitive and those are those institutions that are actually very much involved in corruption. So journalists are actually very much restricted to write about, for instance, Sepah, Revolutionary Guard Corps corruption, and other similar institutions. But these are often like the pattern. But the problem is that as there is no protection for journalists, any random institutions, even like municipality or the city council, could fill in a complaint against a journalist. A police could fill in a complaint against journalists. And when journalists have there is a private, actually, if a person, not an institution, fill in a complaint against journalists, then the situation is even more difficult for the journalists. Because state institutions, some of them function under the presidential administration, some of them. And when, with the change of presidential administration, the norm is often that the new president wants to show his mercy. And they say that, oh, we just ignore all these complaints that we have received to our administration as complaints against newspapers, and we just forget about them. Yeah, so this is this is the answer to the question.
No, that's exactly what I was interested in. Thank you. And I can understand how it's not entirely always clear, and I'm sure that it was made that way for a reason. So our next question is from Sanford Weiner in the audience. Are there any underground newspapers? And if so, what has been their success?
Well, that's a difficult question. With this access to the internet, it's difficult to answer what a newspaper is. So if we are talking about paper newspapers, paper news outlets, or paper publications, I'm not sure whether what is being published illegally under the ground in the Iranian context could be considered newspaper. Perhaps we can assign a different name for them. We can, for instance, call them night letters or something like that. But there are many actually online publications that are being managed by activists from inside the country. There are many of them, and yet they exist, and they often publish first-hand reports from the current affairs in the Iranian context. And one thing that could be also interesting for others is that in the Iranian context, there could be different level of control according to the level of the influence of the news outlet. We have in the Iranian context, for instance, we have annual publications, we have monthly publications, we have magazines, and then we have newspapers, and then we have news agencies, then we have TV, radio, and we also have student papers. For instance, if you look at the content that is being published by student papers, that is only allowed to be distributed inside the university environment, you won't believe that it's being produced inside the Iranian context. You will think that it's being produced in a totally free context. And again, if you look at like annual publications, you wouldn't see the same content in newspapers or in monthly magazines, for instance. There is less control depending on the authority's understanding of the level of the influence of that particular news outlet. So if a particular news outlet has a wider audience, more control.
Fantastic, thank you. So a reminder to those in the audience, we still have time for a couple more questions. So please send those in through the Zoom chat or YouTube comments if you're on YouTube. Another question that I have for you, Dr. Ranji, is what organizations exist in Iran or outside of Iran to help journalists have more agency with their publication, have more accessibility with publishing in Iran?
Well, if we want to talk about organizations that exist outside Iran, I'm not quite yet actually sure about the journalists' willingness who are actually in Iran to work with them, because that's a quite sensitive act. And many of the journalists that are being arrested are often being charged of working with external organizations and then being categorized as spying organizations. But inside the country, there are some minor associations. For instance, we have Tehran-based Association of Journalists that was actually established a few years ago. And I know that there are many critical journalists who are the member of that association, although they are under a lot of pressure themselves, but they still have some, on some occasions, they send letters, they release petitions, and they work for journalist freedom. But again, they cannot be really radical. It's just that it puts them into risk. About actually organizations outside the country that could increase journalistic agency inside the country, I think that's difficult to answer. Most of these organizations outside the Iranian context are human rights organizations that are themselves funded by states. So it makes the picture even more complex. There are, of course, I know that, like for instance, there are courses that journalists in the Iranian context can take at universities or academic institutions or research institutions outside the Iranian context to, to improve the knowledge of journalism, but it's also, as we have seen in the case of many journalists, with even participating in a simple workshop, They are being charged with collaborating with foreign forces.
Thank you. To further expand on that, what, in your opinion, if you have any, say, ideas, what organizations could either be what organizations set in place in Iran, what could be done to improve the organizations in order to make the journalistic environment less restrictive, or what organizations or types of maybe not organizations, but institutions could be implemented, if they don't already exist, to help make the journalistic environment less restrictive?
That's a very difficult question to answer, because the Islamic Republic has shown no signs of loosening its grip on media, both online communication platforms and printing publications. So the question is, as long as the political context of Iran stays the same, is there any room for improvement? Is there any chance for any association, for any union to be born and to start functioning? That could be perhaps the bigger question before answering your question. But as I also mentioned in my book, in the conclusion, I think that the only solution would be just strengthening, in whatever form it could be, the independent associations or unions that journalists are involved in inside the Iranian context. And these associations should definitely fight for both economic safety and political safety of Iranian journalists. Yeah.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. Considering the limitations you outlined, how reliable is the news coming out of Iran, and how should one decipher the news?
Yes. Well, it depends on which news outlets we are talking about when we talk about news coming out of Iran. If we, for instance, as I also showed on my slides, there are some news organizations or news outlets, newspapers mainly, that are still practicing, to a certain extent, critical journalism. And they are actually, many of journalists who work in these news outlets publish very good reports about like people being killed in the protest. And I remember I also read a very good report a few days ago on the workers who died in the accident they were working in mines and they just lost their lives. And there were reports on who were these workers and what were their life stories. And there are many reports like this. And also there are, as I said, reports on families. And there were also reports when there was a fire incident at Evin prison. There were good reports by these newspapers. So it depends which news organization you are looking at. There are news organizations, news agencies, and newspapers that are only just the mouthpiece of the state. And they, in many cases, they actually act as the hand of the intelligence services. They just assign a certain sentence or a certain charge for activists or journalists even before the trial session. So it depends which news outlets you consume. Newspapers, there are certain reformist-owned newspapers, and there are also a few, again, reformist-owned news agencies. And as I said, there are certain web pages online publications that are being managed by activists from inside the country, that you can just gain access, and they are, to a certain extent, to a higher extent, are reliable. Otherwise, I don't think the news that are coming from those news outlets closely affiliated and closely owned and closely controlled by state institutions are not really reliable.
Thank you. So we have time for about one more question, and this one is also from the audience, and it's a good question to end on. What do you see as the future of true journalism in Iran, and what should take place for that to happen?
The future of true journalism, where the question is, does true journalism exist actually in other countries nowadays? Or how do we see true journalism? And I can say, for instance, I live in Norway, in the Norwegian context, which is actually identified as a free context with it's ranked one of the first countries in terms of press freedom. I would say the situation regarding what many consider as critical journalism and true journalism is quite precarious. But for true journalism, how I see it, I think as there exists resistance, I'm optimistic. So, and what should take place for that? Again, I emphasize on independent associations and unions. First of all, we need to sort of completely demolish the current political system, perhaps. And now we need independent associations and unions. We need independent news organizations that could actually safeguard the journalists' economic and political safety. Yeah, thanks.
Great.
I hope I could answer questions.
Yes, no, this was fantastic. It was really great getting to talk further. I really admired your book and how you set this out yourself, that so many people like to focus as if journalists don't have this type of agency. So I was really, really happy to have you on so we could get further into the weeds about journalism, because so many people, like you wrote in your book, jump to censorship, and that's that. But there's so many minute details, and I'm glad that we got to further get into the weeds in the Q&A session. So thanks to the audience for those great questions, and thanks for joining us. And especially thanks to Dr. Banafsheh Ranji for joining us. If you enjoyed the talk, which I'm sure you did, please check out her book. It's called Journalistic Practices in Restrictive Contexts, a Sociological Approach to the Case of Iran. Also, please subscribe to our newsletter on our website, or just check us out on social media so that you can be notified about our upcoming events. Our next Spotlighting an Author event is October 27th with Amir Yahya Ayatollahi. We'll be discussing his book, Political Conservatism and Religious Reformation in Iran, 1905 to 1979, Reconsidering the Monarchic Legacy. And also, if you find today's event interesting, we do have some other content on our website that discusses media. For example, you can check out our YouTube channel and see Television in Iran, an Oral History by Kambiz Mahmoudi. And also, please follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, Iran 1400 Project. And feel free to check out our website and send us an email if y'all have any ideas or things you'd like to see come to fruition on the project. Feel free to let us know. Thank you again, Dr. Ranji, for joining us. This was a lovely conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you again for the invitation. Thanks the audience for joining.